program, what we like to do is if you've written a question on a card, can you hold it up, because we have a couple people in the audience who have volunteered to run around and collect card questions. Or if you have thought of a question, maybe this is a good time to write it down. And just while people are thinking about that, I got a question. And I'll address that to Dr. Rose. What can we do to communicate better with the public on oil and gas related issues? That's my question.
Noise, yeah, okay. Good question. One I think we've all faced, and I don't have any firm answers, but I've got some ideas. Number one, I think we need to recognize that the oil companies, for whatever reason, with the possible exception of Chevron, have taken the fifth on this issue. They are the organizations that have the money to put into an intelligent presentation to the general public, and they're not doing it for whatever reason. So that leaves it, as far as I can see, to the professionals. The media, TV and print media, aren't interested in mathematics, they aren't interested in science. What they seem to be interested in is people suffering hardship stories. I happen to believe that within our society, this society and APG, there are some absolutely extraordinary people who have extraordinary stories to tell. And for that reason, we are going to start identifying those kind of people, writing stories about them, putting them in the Explorer, and sending them around the country to every newspaper we can find. We are also going to identify people who have been successful at successfully impacting the public consciousness with regard to geological issues, and bringing those stories through the Explorer to the AAPG membership so folks can see it can be done, and here's how people do it. Third, I don't know who's the person to do this, but we need somebody to write a really good novel about geology. We have an incredible story to tell. I am so proud of our contribution to the 20th century. And we need to find a way to tell the American public that story.
Do any of our other panelists want to make a comment on that? Or? Well, how's the question selection process going? Do we have any? Bring them up here. This will keep us going here. I've got one that says, for the panel, what do you think are the biggest geology questions still to be addressed?
Define life.
Well, I think in the stratigraphy is cyclostratigraphy and detailing the time scale, getting better ages from cyclostratigraphy, which is essentially the molecular cycles.
So the question is, what do you think are the biggest geology questions still to be addressed?
I'm not sure whether I'm answering the question, but the biggest challenge for geology relates to GIS system and transmission of knowledge. We have huge amounts of data, huge amount of background, and it gets lost. So before we define more things to do, I think we have to salvage a lot of information. Let me give you an example. I can easily get seismic regional cross-section across West Siberia and have students working on it. but I cannot get easily seismic regional cross-section across large portions of the United States and get students working on it. So it's the system that is biting us. So in each case, you can look at it and say, you know, there are systemic problems, and I think we rather than thinking of new final projects for the geologists to work, like the Lord knows the origin of the Earth and that sort of thing, I think one has to go and make sure that we're not going to lose an awful lot of information, and then maybe in 300 years from now, archaeologists or geoarchaeologists will reinvent the wheel for us.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that? We're still on the biggest geology question. Okay, we'll go to, here's a question for the panel. Since most geologists currently work on the prospect scale, where will new big ideas in geologic research come from?
I don't think that can be revealed that easy. But in general, there is still a heck of a lot we don't understand, or we don't have under control. It is a challenge. If we knew it, it would have been done. We know a lot, but there's even more we have to do. And one thing to make progress is to go, not forget geophysics and geochemistry, but to go back also to the rock and find out what can we do with the rock. What does it mean? At the moment we try that the computer tells us what it is. That's bull. It goes faster and therefore management likes it. Well, tell management and kick it in the known parts. We have to go back and see what it means, and there's a lot to learn, fun as well as so scientific, but also economic. So there's a lot going on, and we need more students.
Any of our other panelists like to address the question on where the new big ideas in geologic research will be coming from in the future?
I think we have to recognize that ideas are not necessarily the product of the scientific method. The point being is that data generate interesting ideas. And it's the discovery and the surprise of data you didn't expect. The biggest source of information, which is not used for general science and mostly for prospects, is 3D seismic. 3D seismic, if you put it together on regional maps, it allows you to give you a 3D structural view of any province in the world I have seen, which is radically different from anything you'll find in any textbook. So if 3D seismic on a larger scale becomes available for people to do things other than prospect definition, that will cause a huge increase in the progress in our science.
Are there any other comments? Well, here I have a question on a slightly different topic. What's the panel's thoughts about peak oil? Are we at U.S. peak oil? Are we at global peak oil?
When I was the branch chief for the Oil and Gas Resource Group in 1973-76, at that time I was about 38 years old. And I was suddenly found that I had been assigned to supervise M. King Hubbard, who was a favorite child, scientific stepchild of Senator Scoop Jackson, to the permanent chagrin of the then director of the U.S. Geological Survey, Vincent McKelvey. I can tell you some interesting things about Hubbard. One was that he was totally unsupervisable. The other is that without question, he had the most colossal, inflated ego of anyone I've ever met in my life. And that includes several geologists that some of you may be familiar right here in Houston. The fundamental assumptions in peak oil are fallacious, because Hubbard started with the idea of what you and I would call today conventional crude oil. Now, to quote my friend Wolfgang Schoenberger over there, if you're looking at the supply of milk, you don't care whether the milk comes from one kind of a cow or from another kind of a cow, because you put it on your breakfast cereal. Your car doesn't care where the oil came from. It could have come from Canadian tar sands, or it could have come from offshore Gulf of Mexico. So what's happening today is that we are, even now, moving away from what 30 years ago we call conventional oil and gas. Now, where's the boundary? Is the boundary with, for example, if you talk about natural gas, is the boundary with shale gas? Is it with coal bed methane? And Hubbard's concept did not take that transition, that phase into account. It was a 01 kind of a mechanism. McKelvey, even though he didn't know the first thing about the oil business, was correct about one thing, and that was that the ingenuity of man would in fact contribute very substantially to the answer. The interesting thing is that McKelvey was probably closer to the right answer than Hubbard was, for the wrong reasons. But part of the right reason was that McKelvey understood that technology will continue to advance. We are not going to quit seeing technological improvements. And so the question about peak oil is the wrong question. It's misleading. The question we ought to be asking ourselves is, what can we say about the convergence of crude oil supply today with growing consumption tomorrow? That convergence is what the critical question is. Thank you.
Anybody else on our panel like to talk about peak oil? Are we at global peak oil or U.S. peak oil today?
Pete, why don't you tell that story to the public? The Joe Six-pack.
Bert, thank you for the complimentary remark. I've got my hands full.
Next year.
We have a question for Peter Vale. Okay, the question is, why would Exxon allow you to make public your discovery about that seismic reflections do not always follow lithologic context? Why didn't they want to keep it proprietary?
Well, I wrote this in a research paper for Exxon, and then we had a meeting between the Carter Research Lab and the Humble Research Lab here in Houston, and at this meeting we all gave papers, and so I gave a talk on this concept, and then the manager of the Humble Lab, he got up and he got the whole audience just roaring in laughter about how the reflections must bounce off the back of fossils. so he just ridiculed me for this time, and this also happened that I was asked to give a talk for one of the universities in England, and Professor Matthews was in the audience. So Matthews was the Lyman Matthews of the Oceanic Stripes, and so after I gave my talk, he got up and said, "You mean we've been teaching our students wrong all these years?" And so I said, "No, I explained, that the time surfaces, were the stratal surfaces, which were really producing the reflection patterns that you see on the side of it. And so the geophysics wasn't wrong. It was just the concept that he never did agree with that. So anyway, it was just a lot of controversy, and so the company didn't have any problem with releasing that. Everybody at Shell used to buy a copy. So we didn't have that memoir then, but this was before there, and so I don't know if it was Bert or Bert instigated talking to our manager at Exxon, who was Walter Eckland, and encouraged him to publish all this. And so Walter Eckland came to my office one day and said, we think it'd be good for Exxon to publish this material. And at Exxon we had published prepared a series of what we call blue books, research reports, that were circulated in the company. So what we decided to do was to put these as a series of papers, and then they had to be edited. So Bob Mitchell, the reason he's gray-haired, he edited all those reports. And he worked with a colleague that was very meticulous, and that's why Bob says he got his gray hair. But anyway, that's the reason. And when these reports came out, well, we had the okay pulps, and it turned out to be a real good seller. Thanks a lot here to Bert's encouragement for the Shell people to buy it. And then in the report we published the tertiary long lap chart, but on the Cretaceous chart we had a big hunk of it left out, and so we wanted to publish that, and so our manager at the time wouldn't let us publish that. So the Cretaceous chart was never published completely in AAPG Memoir 26. It took another almost 10 years to finally get that published. SEM Memoir 42. But Exxon was pretty good. I got a lot of papers published. The way I really used to do that, affiliates would ask us at research to give talks for them at various meetings to represent their companies. And so I got asked to do a lot of these talks. And so I'd bring the paper. I said, well, I gave this talk for such a company, and now I need to publish it. And that worked pretty well. So I got a few papers published that night.
Thank you. Question. Okay, here's a question for anyone on the panel. What do you think of Matt Simmons' book, Twilight in the Desert? This is a book Matt Simmons wrote about the oil business in Saudi Arabia.
I can start that. I guess up front we need to acknowledge that Matt Simmons did us a couple of favors. He wrote a book for the general consumption that made it clear that the most important oil producer in the world is not going to tell us how much oil they have. Get used to it. The second thing he made us understand is that the 25 million a day that was being projected by one or more U.S. government agencies was not going to happen. 12, 13, 15 maybe. Now, I have a very good friend who used to be chief petroleum engineer for Saudi Aramco in the late 70s and early 80s. And I talked with him at some length about the engineering in the Simmons book. And his commentary was, to put it charitably, scathing. But let's give the devil his due. He did us all a favor.
Anyone else want to make a comment? Well, then we have a question for, I guess, Dr. Numa. This would be a good question for you. How can we ensure more students today eagerly choose geology as their course of study?
I'm not sure what the answer is, but I always start realizing that for some unknown reason to me, the industry is always the bad guy in the papers. Don't read the papers, use your brains. Because every organization, every type of company in the United States goes through these cycles. Laying off people, merging, all these things. It is badly reported in the press. Because somewhere it is not sensational enough. So forget that. Then, where do we stand? And like I said a little bit earlier, I'm absolutely convinced that geology will be a very good direction for the next 10 and very likely next 20 years. That means the chances out there is very likely more oil and gas than we realize. We don't yet change to other sources of energy a little bit, but percentages in total. So we need something. It becomes more difficult, therefore we need people. And therefore we need geologists, geophysicists, and so on. But what we also have to do in the educational system has to come together between companies and universities. And it was not for nothing that I walked away from LSU. I got sick and tired of it. Because the hard rockers didn't like what I did and a few others. Having many students that go to companies instead of writing papers that go in Nature and is based on, what is it, 10 pennies in a ceremony? That is science. Well, to me, I'm old-fashioned. Students go first, and with the student you do research. And as long as, when we go back to this, and there are still people with normal brains in the universities also, let's get going. And not only the APG, but also all the sub-companies. I think somewhere we have to work on that. And very likely we have to do something, reporting through papers and so on. What are these things? But basically in the style of what does it do to people? Let's not talk geology. Only at the bottom somewhere. Geologists can be helpful here. And all that, there is enough to do, and I see a really good future for geology. But we have to work together, and geology training should not be only geology or geophysics or so on, it should be a mixture of all these things, including engineering.
How many of you in the last year visited a university to talk about what you do? Folks, that's about 10% of the hands. What are the rest of you doing?
How about high schools and undergrad, or get them younger too?
Let me also add a quietly dissenting voice from Burt Valley and perhaps Arnold Allen. I think the biggest part of the problem is that our young people growing up don't understand economics. They don't understand the market. They're going to understand supply and demand. Our business has always been cyclical. It's the nature of the resource business. Now, I can certainly agree, I think here with Bert and with Arnold, that the larger companies ought to be smart enough to understand that in down cycles, that's the time when you take your staff and you start generating the plays for when things get better. And they didn't do that. Exploration is inherently a long-term business, and the way managements have responded is very much short-term. That has actually hurt the companies. So I don't condone that. But what I think is also important to understand that you're probably not going to be working for the same company 5 years after you first came on board. I mean, I never could hold a job for more than about 6 years. And that's the nature of it. And that means then that security is up here. Security is in your competence, in your ability to learn, in your contacts, your communication skills. And if you can just get people to quit living from paycheck to paycheck, live within their means, they can weather this. In fact, they can prosper. I never changed jobs in a cycle that I didn't come out better. The biggest flaw is that our people, our young people, don't understand the way the market works. For a country that prides itself on being the free market capital of the world, the knowledge of our populace about economics, free market economics, is abysmal. And the press is the worst of the bunch.
Do any other panelists have a comment about attracting students to the society?
I like to tell Pete that I agree with you 100%. The problem I have, we have also problem, coming from the industry to academia also has its problems and its moments. I had, while I was still active, tried to put economics as part of the curriculum of geologists. I got voted down by my own faculty. So there is the problem. And that's what they call academic elitism. Now, the other problem is economics, as you mean, it starts with inundating students with credit cards, which they don't know how to pay off, forcing them to take very large loans so that after they have finally they finished their studies, they are something like $50,000 to $80,000 in debt. That's poor economics too. So I would suggest, as part of the whole thing, the APG should ask Susie Orman, simply go back and tell the kids something about simple pocketbook economics, including the stock market. So I would support you 100% and more.
Thank you. That sounds like another career.
You can do it, you're a young Turk.
We'll make this the final question. I think it's kind of interesting because some of our panelists are born in Europe and the other panelists were born in America. What should we do to make APG and SCPM a truly international society? Should we change the names of the societies, or how do we more unite with our international counterparts?
I'll start this. I'm sure I won't finish it. We need to understand the demographics of what's happening to geologists in North America. We are a gradually diminishing breed. And let's face it, our resource endowment is gradually being exploited. The future resources are not in North America. They're in Russia. They're in the Middle East. And the future expanding economies, the oil countries that are going to be using the stuff, are China and India and Korea and Taiwan. How many of you have read a book called by Thomas Friedman called The World is Flat? Okay, I'm going to give you one more gift. Every single one of you ought to read that book this week. Because what is happening right now is the globalization of the E&P business, primarily because of the growing industry in the eastern part of the world, as well as the lack of new students coming into American, Canadian universities. We are going to be seeing, within the next 5 years, instead of mostly Anglo-Saxon faces around these tables, we're going to be seeing Chinese faces, and Indian faces, and Malaysian faces, and Arab faces. If I were today a recruiter looking to hire bright, qualified young help, you know where I'd be looking? I'd be looking in Hungary, and Poland, in Ukraine. And when I talked to them 2 months ago about the starting salaries for American geologists, I saw eyes light up and jaws drop. Their English is pretty good.